Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning or good afternoon. We'll take a minute or two to let people filter into the room. That's sort of an antique way of putting it. And then we're going to go ahead. I'm looking forward to this event. We got a surprisingly large audience, and in a short, surprising because it was in a relatively short time. And we're trying something a little different in format today. It will be a little longer than our usual events, but I think I'm looking forward to it. So I hope you are as well. I'll begin now. We are talking about cybersecurity considerations for data localization and regulation. In some ways, this was inevitable. Countries want to assert sovereignty over their networks, over their physical infrastructure of cyberspace. Given the growing role of data in the economy, of course, data localization, data control is an important part of this. And we've seen terms like data governance and data sovereignty spring up. Reasonable, and it's understandable that countries would try and expand the boundaries of sovereignty to safeguard the interests of their citizens. And one of the tools they do to do that is to require data localization, which our panelists will talk about. Data localization runs immediately into the fact that you have global networks and global business. So there's an implicit tension in that we can hopefully think about how we might address. The rules for data governance are coming out in China, in Europe, in many countries, not the US, since we have a hard time coming up with rules, but this will be a topic, I think, for the next few years. What we are also going to talk about is the inadvertent effect of data localization, the extension of sovereignty on cybersecurity. It is a globally interconnected network, and when you start putting up regulatory barriers, you can affect the ability to protect it. So good set of topics, great panelists. Let me go through them for you briefly. Their full bios are on the website. Peter Swire is the Holder Chair of Law and Ethics at the Georgia Institutes of Technology and an old friend. He's also the Associate Director for Policy at Georgia Tech's Institute for Information Security and Privacy. Many people know him from his time on the Obama Review Group on Intelligence and Communications. And I know him, of course, dating back to the Clinton administration when he was the Chief Counselor for Privacy in OMB. So a groundbreaking role there. DeBrae Kennedy-Mayo is in some ways Peter's partner in crime. She's a research faculty member at the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech. She has extensive government experience. She's an author and is someone who's done a lot of work with Peter and by herself on privacy and law enforcement. Victoria Baines, visiting fellow, Bournemouth University. Until 2017, Victoria was Facebook's trust and safety manager for the region. That must have been quite a handful as a job. She led the strategy team at Europol's European Cybercrime Center. That's a great background. And prior to that, she was a principal analyst at SOCA, the UK's Serious Organized Crime Agency. So also a tremendous background. We're lucky to have Andreas Mitrakas, head of unit, market certification and standardization at ENISA, right, which all of us are familiar with, of course. Dr. Mitrakas has been at ENISA since 2005. He's currently in Athens, so we're all feeling a bit of envy. And he has extensive experience in the private sector before his time at ENISA, so also a strong background. The final panelist is Raphael Marichez, Chief Security Officer, South Europe for Palo Alto Networks. We thought it was important to get a network operator in. But Raphael has also, like all of our panelists, tremendous background working for the French government, first as the Chief Information Security Officer for the French Ministry of Interior. Most of you know that the French Ministry of Interior is not like our Department of Interior, which manages the national parks. It has a much more important security function. And so we're very grateful that Raphael will join us today. He'd also worked in the Prime Minister's office and joined Palo Alto about 2 years ago. So our format today is a little bit of an experiment, as I said. I'm looking forward to it. We'll begin by having Peter and DeBrae give a presentation on lawmaking, privacy, and security, and what that means for data governance. We'll follow that by remarks from Andreas and on what ANISA is doing. And then there'll be a moderated discussion with Andreas, Raphael, and myself to talk about what we've heard. And I think we have time for audience questions, but that will be at the end. So if I could ask you to hold your questions and use the chat function, that would be helpful. With that, let me turn it over to Peter and DeBrae.
So welcome everybody. Thanks to Jim and everybody for having our chance to be with you here today. This is our first public presentation of a paper called The Effects of Data Localization on Cybersecurity. And as Jim mentioned, and people in the audience know, there's been a big trend towards localization laws, either as a matter of fact or as a matter of law. A lot of our own work has been on the European Union after the Schrems case. And even transfer of IP addresses has been held in enforcement actions to be beyond what's allowed to the United States and other third countries. And many of these localization laws are justified in the name of security because, for instance, it would limit US or other non-EU access to personal data in Europe. And as many of you also know, India is in the late stages of passing its own privacy law, and it has a very substantial data localization component as well. So our paper, as far as we can tell, is the first systematic examination of how these data localization practices pose large risks to cybersecurity. And just a note about scope, we're looking at defensive cybersecurity, not at offensive operations. And we're looking at hard data localization where transfers are prohibited. We're not talking here about when you have to mirror or store data locally, which has its own issues, but the focus here is when data is not allowed to be transferred. Okay. So the outline of what we're talking today is a brief discussion about when is there privacy and security, they work together, and when is it privacy versus security, where they work in opposite directions. DeBrae will take the lead on some of the public comments, a couple hundred public comments on the issue we've seen from the EU. And then our paper proposes 3 categories of harm to cybersecurity. The first is to integrated risk management of an organization's system. The second is a quite pervasive blockade against third-party cybersecurity services. And the third is a general obstacle to information sharing, which is often thought to be so important for cybersecurity. So is privacy with security or against security? This is something I and others have worked on for a long time. And we'd love it to the extent that privacy and security go together. So with encryption, effective encryption, there's security against unauthorized access, there's privacy for the communication. In Europe and elsewhere, there's been a tremendous amount of hope and effort to try to create privacy enhancing technologies. And these are things that can prevent unauthorized access. However, and it's not fun to point to this when we're in privacy conferences, there also can be a very significant tension between privacy, don't let people see the data, and security, where we want the data for some reason, such as addressing attacks. And so in our paper, we say a measure designed to increase privacy reduces cybersecurity to the extent it hits CIA, to the extent the privacy measure increases the risk of unauthorized access or to confidentiality concern, reduces integrity, or reduces availability. I think these are well-known definitions in cybersecurity. So in our research, and I'd be glad to be corrected by folks on this call who are expert, we were able to find almost no official statements about how to address this privacy versus security concern when it comes to data localization. And especially in European terms, privacy, data protection is a fundamental right. And so how do you integrate your discussion of that with the risk management approach that people are used to for cybersecurity? It's hard to know how to do risk management cost benefit against fundamental rights. And it's tempting not to really say much about it because that's such a difficult conversation. And one item that comes out of the research is, to the extent there needs to be more room for cybersecurity, maybe there can be exceptions that allow data transfers for cybersecurity purposes. DeBrae, I turn it to you.
So we reviewed approximately 200 comments that were submitted to the European Data Protection Board in late 2020 concerning data transfers. Approximately 25% of these comments discuss data localization or some similar concept, like transforming the EU into a digital island or returning the EU to a pre-internet era. We found that many of the comments related to data localization could be grouped into 4 categories: EU commenters that were tech-focused, EU commenters that were business-focused, US-related commenters, and tech businesses themselves. So for the EU commenters that were tech-focused, we saw organizations like BSA, the Software Alliance, ECO, the Global Data Alliance, and ITI. For EU commenters that were business-focused, we saw several confederations of industry, such as those in Finland, the Czech Republic, Sweden, Ireland, and Poland. For US-related commenters, we saw the US mission to the EU, the US Chamber of Commerce, the American Chamber in the EU, in the Czech Republic, in Ireland, Spain, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And then we saw tech businesses themselves. CrowdStrike and Palo Alto Networks, which are cybersecurity-focused companies. We saw Duality Technology, which is a privacy tech company. We also saw Vodafone and Workday. Now back to you, Peter.
Thank you, DeBrae, and thank you for your great work in synthesizing all of these comments and the wide range of commenters who were pointing at data localization concerns for cybersecurity. Okay, so here's the first of our 3 categories to try to systematize the effects on cybersecurity. People in this audience are probably familiar with the International Standards Organization 27001 and 27002. And those controls are grouped into 14 major controls with subcontrols. And in our appendix to our paper, we show that 13 of these 14 controls are disrupted by data localization requirements. It's harder to manage your assets. It's harder to govern your access controls, know what acquisitions you have. It's very, very hard to do audit. And so one way to show the pervasive disruptive effect of data localization is to say that almost every aspect of a company's risk management structure can be disrupted by these kinds of rules. What happens with these kinds of rules? Well, one thing is a manager, the chief information security officer, loses the big picture, cannot see what's going on inside the jurisdictions where there's limits on getting data out of it. One theme, and I teach in a school of cybersecurity and privacy with a lot of computer scientists, is complexity is the enemy of cybersecurity. If you're having to chop up your system into all these national or regional flows, it's harder to do it well. It provides more openings for the attackers. A big theme is the less efficient division of labor, right? For a lot of cybersecurity problems, you have your frontline people everywhere around the world, but then when you escalate it to level 2, level 3, level 4, you don't have those top people, your best people everywhere in the world. And so they literally might not be able to look at problems that are happening in countries that have localization. And then one finding in general is if it turns out there's more than one area of localization, China, EU, India, then there's no place you can centralize the data. So there's limits. One strategy, if there's only one place with localization, is just put everything in Europe, but that's not going to be the rules going forward. So as an example from the comments, the recommendations would prohibitively disrupt routine business operations, including those that ensure European employees get paid on time, that malfeasance cannot commit financial crime, and the responsible monitoring for cybersecurity threats. Okay, that's a problem. It's harder to manage an organization's security. The second category of disruption would be to third-party cybersecurity services. Depending how you define it, this market is large. It's about $200 billion a year. It includes cloud services and it includes the fact that many organizations have limited expertise in-house. The key point about data localization is that it limits the access to the state-of-the-art for the best security services. Purchasers of the state-of-the-art, the best, some companies have 20, 30, 50 different providers of cybersecurity services. You want to get the best you can get from anywhere in the world for the particular things you're working on. But if, for instance, EU or India cannot buy services from outside those regions, it means they're not getting best of breed. It means that EU and India companies are required by law to use not the best cybersecurity services. And so in the name of protecting data, the result is weakening protection. Basically, a region that has data localization becomes a target because they can't get the best cybersecurity services. So one comment on this is that ENISA, and we're going to hear more from ENISA later today, specifically highlighted the increasing number of phishing campaigns and ransomware attacks on healthcare systems since the beginning of COVID. And it said, this Czech Republic commenter said, Europe cannot afford to lower cybersecurity standards or compromise resilience of this critical infrastructure by hampering access to security solutions and measures. So we're not the ones who are saying these are the problems. We've looked at all the comments and we've systematized what these problems turn out to be. Third and final category is information sharing in cybersecurity. Defenders need to collaborate. Defenders need to share information about attacks. And as just one simple answer, and Palo Alto will say more about this perhaps, IP addresses that are malicious, now you can't share that globally and say where the attacks are coming from and have risk associated with that. If we blockade against information sharing, it makes it harder to investigate cyber crimes. You can't share data about what the evidence is. It disrupts forensics for data breaches and weakens anti-fraud efforts because it encourages people to go to different jurisdictions to do their attacks. And so as an example of comments on this from CrowdStrike, adversaries innovated at a record pace. It's important to empower defenders to leverage global data flows, big data analytics, and machine learning to protect against ever-evolving threats. And cross-border flows are necessary for cybersecurity, not much unlike how national security depends upon cross-border data flows in the public sector. So our last slide, conclusion, localization done in the name of security, we believe will often undermine security. It'll disrupt these three categories we've talked about: integrated risk management, third-party services, and information sharing. And we say in the end, unless proponents of localization address these, then given these serious apparent concerns, the presumption should be that data localization will significantly disrupt cybersecurity. And I think that presumption is warranted based on the analysis we present and based on the comments from many experts. As a first step then, for a policy matter, I hope that regions, countries will consider when exceptions for cybersecurity can be defined to protect data. And beyond that, we believe that cybersecurity agencies and cybersecurity experts need to address the risk from data localization. It's not easy to say that you want to open up data flows in many settings, as Jim Lewis said. However, you're really disrupting the ability to do cybersecurity for people around the world. So thanks for the opportunity to speak. Let me turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for being prompt. That was a lot of good data. Are the comments accessible publicly, or do you have them? Did you keep them to yourself?
DeBrae, is there a place they can go to read all the comments? Can't hear you.
Yes, I can put that in a chat function. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Victoria, who will talk about lawmaking, privacy, and security dynamics. Victoria, thank you for joining us. I'm really pleased that you could be here. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. And we'll have a quick switch of the screen. So fingers crossed. Let's see if we can get this set up. Okay. How's that? Good? Excellent. That's a great start. Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here speaking to you today. As Peter and as DeBrae have highlighted in their excellent work, The last 10 years have witnessed the introduction of some landmark data governance measures in the European Union and beyond. And in the interests of safety, security, and that fundamental right that Peter highlighted to a private life, data has been subjected to controls. But at the same time, measures aimed at increasing transparency, at asserting individual ownership over personal data, and at fostering innovation have emphasized the need for openness. So there's a tension between control and openness, which is a key dynamic in data governance that I feel merits further scrutiny and continued consideration by stakeholders and legislators alike. And it's worth pointing out that although the research that I've been conducting has a slightly different focus, I'm looking in particular at legislation in the EU that is aimed at increasing contestability, portability, and safety. It's slightly uncanny and to some extent, from a researcher's perspective, really quite encouraging that Peter and DeBrae and I come to some very similar conclusions and findings. It's always good, isn't it, as a lone researcher, to find that you're aligned to somebody else's research. So in the field of public safety, the relationship between security and safety on the one hand and privacy on the other, it is often depicted as a trade-off, not least in the debate concerning online surveillance, which is one of my areas of focus. And according to this framing, the ability of government authorities to intrude into citizens' private communications is to some degree accepted for the prevention and investigation of serious crimes and of terrorism, and where there is judicial or similar oversight to challenge its abuse. So following this line of argument, in countries where there is greater surveillance of citizens' online and offline activities, privacy is ceded in the interest of public safety. And in those countries in which citizens enjoy greater freedom, this freedom may be accompanied by a perception of reduced levels of public safety and security. Now, of course, this thinking is by no means unassailable, but it is the foundation of most intelligence and national security work the world over. The more a government knows about its citizens, the greater the control it has over public safety and security issues, whether these be misdemeanors or national security threats. But this is not, of course, simply a public safety privacy interaction. The dynamic becomes more complex when the concept of information security is introduced, or cybersecurity as it's interchangeably known, which if you're like me, I'm a classicist by background, so I always revert to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is probably quite an outdated definition now, but it's the state of being protected against the unauthorized use of information, as Peter mentioned, especially electronic data or the means taken to achieve this. And information security really incorporates key elements of privacy and public safety, while at the same time being not quite one or the other. A couple of examples to illustrate some of these tensions. So in 2015, many of you will be aware that the then Belgian Privacy Commission initiated a case against Facebook for its use of data cookies to track the web browsing of internet users in Belgium, even those without Facebook accounts. And the Court of First Instance in Brussels ruled that this processing of personal data violated Belgian law. Facebook defended its use of the cookies precisely for security reasons, outlining its use to help differentiate legitimate visits to the website from illegitimate ones, and warning that legal action could undermine their efforts to keep the accounts of people in Belgium safe. Now, Facebook was ordered to desist from deploying these cookies. They successfully appealed in 2016 on the basis that the Belgian regulator had no jurisdiction over its operations headquartered in Ireland. But as you will know, this did not mark the end of the matter. Facebook was once again convicted in 2018, appealed again in 2019, and the case was subsequently referred to the European Court of Justice. And notwithstanding that the basis for that appeal was squarely on jurisdiction rather than security purpose, the alleged use of that cookie in combating the creation of fake accounts, account takeovers, theft of user content, denial of service attacks, it raises the possibility that if successfully enforced, this prohibition would bring Belgian citizens greater data protection, but at the cost of greater vulnerability to certain threats to their security and that of the services that they use. So in this case, there is no objectively right or wrong in such a pass. It's a situation in which, as Peter was saying, competing rights need to be balanced and alternative solutions developed where possible. And that global dimension also remains pertinent when it comes to interactions between privacy legislation and personal safety. Automated scanning for child sexual abuse material was found to be non-compliant with the EU e-privacy directive after the 21st of December 2020. And that was when the definition of electronic communication service was updated to include services such as voice chat, messaging, and web-based mail, bringing them within the scope of the directive's provisions for the confidentiality of communications and traffic data. Now, immediately, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the US was able to publish data showing an immediate reduction in reports of child sexual abuse material to the EU, which they attributed directly to the directive's prohibition on platforms scanning EU users' content. Now, there was, as you can imagine, a concerted effort from child protection stakeholders, and that managed to achieve a temporary derogation in July 2021 from the provisions of the directive. That applies until August 2024. So while platforms can now resume their operations to combat child sexual exploitation and abuse, we still need to find a more lasting solution that both upholds citizens' right to privacy and the right of children to live free from sexual abuse as enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, if we look at the EU Digital Services Package, so the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, through a similar lens, that allows us to identify a number of potentially problematic impacts for security operations worldwide. And among these is Article 5A of the draft Digital Markets Act. And that obliges gatekeepers, so very large online platforms, to refrain from combining personal data sourced from their core platform services with personal data from any other services offered by that gatekeeper, or with personal data from third-party services. So this speaks precisely to Peter and DeBrae's point about controls on sharing information, controls on using third-party cybersecurity services. As we all know, the very large US platforms are using specialist services. And the reality of cybercrime investigation, whether it's by national law enforcement agencies or by global platforms, is that cross-platform forensic investigation is very often essential to timely enforcement and to the prevention of further offences against citizens and networks. Usernames, registration credentials, email addresses, phone numbers are reused in different online settings. And cross-platform analysis is both good information security practice the world over, and it's a widely used law enforcement technique. In cases involving more sophisticated criminals, like, for instance, Buster Hernandez, also known as Brian Kill, who used sexual blackmail and made death threats to at least 375 child victims, it can take several years of cross-platform analysis by service providers and law enforcement, quite often working together, for a suspect to be identified and brought to justice. So without that ability to link data sets, opportunities to identify suspects and victims can quite easily be missed. Now, the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, it also obliges gatekeepers to allow the installation and effective use of third-party software applications or software application stores using or interoperating with operating systems of that gatekeeper. It's basically what we know as side loading, so allowing third-party apps. And that's from Article 6, but also to allow business users and providers of ancillary services access to and interoperability with the same systems. Now, there is an ability within that current draft for gatekeepers, these large platforms and app stores, to take proportionate measures to ensure that they do not endanger the integrity of the hardware or the operating system provided by the gatekeeper. However, there is understandable concern and a need for greater clarity concerning those security impacts of such greater openness and the process and precise circumstances for exemption from those articles. What we have at the moment is no clear guidance on which third parties should be excluded from these obligations of the Digital Markets Act for security reasons. And so that means that app stores may lose their ability to apply established security controls that restrict access to those deemed to pose a risk. We have evidence, of course, for a number of years that malicious apps are used by state-sponsored cyber criminals and repressive governments. And so reducing controls in the interest of greater openness is also of primary geopolitical concern, especially right now. And there are inevitable touch points in the UN process, the open-ended working group on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security, but also the proposal led by Russia and China to elaborate a new comprehensive treaty on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes. Moreover, we also know that large online platforms routinely make use of data from different sources in their security operations. And so we have a strange situation where the DMA and its sister act, the Digital Services Act, see security as something of an exceptional issue requiring individual exemptions. So it currently envisages that gatekeepers, very large online platforms, some of the largest platforms in the world, will send individual notifications each time they want a security exemption. But those of us who work in security operations know that what we're actually talking about here are many millions of automated exemptions and exceptions and requests. We have an additional concern with the Digital Services Act with Article 15, where the draft text is providing for the statement by providers to affected users of the reasons for restricting content. And among the types of required information listed are the facts and circumstances relied on in taking the decision, wherever relevant, pursuant to a notice submitted by a government authority, but also to tell people who are subject to content removal exactly what tools, what automated means, what algorithms have been used to remove that content. And why is that of concern? Well, it's of concern because, as with any law enforcement agency, giving so much information that bad actors can be tipped off to the processes and the tools that you use can help them game your systems. And so it can actually leave us all less secure and more vulnerable. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time and really just to talk about what we can do, because so far I've given you all bad news, haven't I? I think we have a parallel process here, of course. I've given you a flavour of the extent to which security, I feel, should be baked into data governance legislation rather than an afterthought that is taken into consideration at a late stage through general consultation with various agencies. So thinking about security first rather than last. But we also have, of course, the foreign policy negotiations from the EU, particularly in the context of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. So comparing the remit of the working groups for the TTC with the EU data governance and really visualizing that, because it helps me to visualize some of these intricacies, we see that security is actually really central, not only to regulatory measures in the EU, but also some of the foreign policy considerations that are being taken up by the TTC. So really, I would like to kind of finish stressing the fact that security absolutely should not be exceptional in any of this EU impending legislation, and in fact goes against some legislation like the Network and Information Security Directive, like the international standards that Peter mentioned with the ISO 27000. And really to end with a plea to security actors to get more involved in some of the negotiations and consultations on these pieces of legislation, and to leave you with some food for thought, not least as that I really come to the same conclusion as Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. I'd quite like to see a dedicated EU chief security officer working exactly on the basis of the European data protection supervisor, whose job would be nothing more and nothing less than to security proof everything that the EU does, and to check whether key issues of national and international security have been taken into sufficient account in our regulations as they develop. But I will leave it at that in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. That was great. Do you have publications? Maybe if you do, you could send them to us on a link and we can post the link to them on the website, because you had some really useful insights. So
absolutely. So I'm sorry, apologies if I'm flicking through, but there is the link to this paper on my second slide. So yes, great. By all means.
We'll do it. Let me know, and that is good timing. It's almost like someone thought about the agenda. We're going to turn to Andreas, who will give us views on what ENISA is doing on some key areas, the aftermath of the Cybersecurity Act, the certification framework, and how data localization affects trust. So Andreas, over to you, please. Oop, you're muted. Muted, Andreas.
Gosh, this is the part of the training on Zoom that I skipped. Thank you, James, and thank you to CIS for the invitation to ENISA to join this panel. I understand that this is not the first time that CIS turns over to ENISA with such a great opportunity to present our views. I thought that this would be a QA session, so inadvertently I did not prepare slides, but what's better than talking out of the top of one's head? So let me start by making the suggestion that indeed, as Peter and DeBrae and implicitly also Victoria suggested, the EU is not looking forward to lowering cybersecurity standards. On the contrary, the tendency is clearly drawn towards enforcing what we have and extending what's around. The current situation in the east borders of the European Union and all the alarm situation that it has caused and provoked, supposedly a good justified grounds for moving further with cybersecurity measures. On the background, I think, need to understand that the European Union is all about a treaty. It's all about an internal market where the Commission has exclusive competence, and such competence is exercised with the support and assistance of the member states, of sovereign member states. So the EU model is slightly different from a federal model that you are, of course, very familiar with. So under this light, looking into how to improve the situation in the internal market requires further measures. I had in mind to mention the Cybersecurity Act of 2019 that foresees a cybersecurity certification framework. Now, what's important about this framework is that it provides for secondary legislation, so adopted implementing acts at the committee level that see to invoke cybersecurity measures at be it at the technical or organizational level. So they're not about new legal requirements, but rather conditions to reinforce and improve on the cybersecurity of systems and networks and how we govern data and so on. So this framework is voluntary, of course, but there's a fairly good prospect that becomes mandatory in specific areas. We have, you're familiar with the proposal for the Network Information Security Directive 2 that looks into critical, essential providers of services, critical areas of the economy that could see requirements concerning them tightened up slightly. And we're looking in such cases like common criteria, furthering the requirements related to the mutual recognition agreement on common criteria, the international agreement in this area, cloud services, of course, and more recently 5G networks. So as you can see in the background, there are repercussions at the international level, at the level of private sector standardization. We're working very closely with GSM Association and suppliers in the field. Now, taking a slightly lateral step, one can think that now we have to deal with privacy and with data. Personal data protection, and all that is listed as a fundamental right in the EU, and rightly so. And we have this typical seesaw situation whereby the more cybersecurity we have, the less privacy we expect, and all that. But I really wonder if in this day and age, this is a genuine concern, because here we're not just faced with the dilemma of an open market or of a protectionist type of measures to support or to delimit access of third country service providers into unsown internal markets. It seems to me that while several very good examples were given, Facebook and so on, Schrems, very important cases, they have impacted transatlantic data flows in a big way and repeatedly. Maybe the situation is slightly more complex. I had in mind Cambridge Analytica, a company that colluded with Facebook, and I mean, both were fined by the regulatory authority in the United Kingdom. And even the CEO was banned from exercising director's duties for a fair period of time. So something really went wrong in that case. In my view, what matters here is the ability of the regulatory authorities in the member states, in the EU member states, to exercise their supervisory rights in the portion of the markets, in the business sectors they control. I think in this day and age, when we have also the geopolitical concerns around 5G networks, concerns about fake news, we can, post Ukraine, be quite open about all these issues. Empowering regulatory authorities needs to be seen under a totally different light. We cannot be naive anymore and believe that whatever we connect, whatever hook in our networks is going to work out fine because there's a help desk, down the phone line. It doesn't work like that anymore. We have walked into this fact in the EU, and I can see it through our working groups and the experts that flock to support technical agencies like ENISA to put such requirements together in comprehensive mode. And we can tell how concerned people are about the level of cybersecurity currently and the opportunity it represents to improve yet further. So this is pretty much what I had in mind for my opening, and looking forward to questions. James, back to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andreas. That was perfect. Let me just tell people where we are in the program. We've gotten a couple good questions. We will answer them at the end, and I hope that all of the speakers will remain on to address some of these questions. We're now scheduled to have a moderated discussion. I think I want to invite all the speakers to feel free to not to moderate, but to speak or discuss. But let me start with Raphael, because we haven't heard from him yet. Raphael, I have some questions for you if you want to say a few minutes of remarks, and then we can turn to a discussion within the group. But what's your reaction to what you've heard so far?
Well, thank you. I was really interested by, first of all, what Peter said at the beginning of the conversation. First, he mentioned that data localization is often justified by security, and it's true that it's really something I heard many times. But I heard this from some people that who I think don't want to think a lot to find it's true a complex way to balance the different purposes that exist behind data localization. Data localization is a technical control that serves different kinds of purposes, and we should not forget the purposes we want to achieve. Purposes can be supply chain management, that can be also, of course, privacy. I think it's the most obvious one. And just say we will do data localization just by security, it's too easy, I think. It's really too easy. And I know it's not easy to find a way to respect the different purposes we are trying to consider. And at the end, supply chain risk management, privacy, security, everything is a kind of risk management. So we have to find a balance that won't compromise either of the different aspects. I don't call for exception as if security would be the magic word to say for security purposes. I call for an exception from the privacy perspective. I don't call for this. I would rather call for what is the purpose behind my process. If I want to collect some data that are useful in a cybersecurity perspective, to track, to filter, to identify an abnormal behavior on a computer system, then it is not an exception. As for me, it is a legitimate purpose. And it's true that obviously, as soon as we will use machine learning, artificial intelligence, telemetry, and I like the word of telemetry, security telemetry, because we are not looking for personal information. We are looking for technical telemetry, but of course it's obvious that every time we will use machine learning, we will analyze a lot of data set that come from a human activity. So obviously at the end, even if you are stroking your fingers on the keyboard, or if you are moving the mouse, potentially it can be considered in this example as potentially personal information. But it is not the purpose of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is something different that has not to be opposed to privacy. And at the same time, it is not exactly the same as privacy. Cybersecurity and privacy as two complementary purposes, two legitimate purposes. And we should find a way to use it. And again, I like the word telemetry because in cybersecurity, we will collect data, which is sometimes personal information, but the truth is it is security telemetry. And I want to make the difference between what we are trying to achieve when we start a process to find, for example, a track of ransomware activity. The objective is not to control a person particularly. So Michael is just don't open the door of the exception to say we will oppose the different purposes. They have to work together. The DPO and the CSO, the Chief Security Officer, have to work together, but we have to be more clever. We have to be clever than just saying it's just a question of data localization. The problem is more complex and the solution will be more complex.
Great, thank you, Raphael. Let me remind people, we have a few questions. Now we will get to them. I'm going to open the discussion and then ask our earlier speakers. I know Peter already has a question. Ask our earlier speakers for their comments. But Raphael, one thing I didn't hear you say was, how do you think this is going to affect your business as Palo Alto? What are the changes you're going to have to make to remain in this? It's a tough one.
As I briefly mentioned, we collect data, technical data coming from the networks and the infrastructure within our customer information systems. This data is called, from our perspective, security telemetry. We want to be able to stitch, to connect, to correlate together this data. And it is really, I won't say mandatory, but it is really more efficient if we are able to stitch the data, to correlate the data independently of the origin, of the geographical origin of data. And obviously, if we create some barriers between geopolitical blocks, between continents, and I also hear sometimes that some people want to be more demanding than the legislation. We of course have the European Union, and sometimes some people want to have their data closer to them in the country, in the region, in the subarctic region. Sometimes, really, if we go to this way, it will be more and more difficult to find out in a complex IT environment some behaviors that are linked to some harmful activity like a ransomware. And I often use the example of the ransomware. Sadly, I have, I think, too many customers affected by ransomware attacks because they considered that data localization was more important than protecting themselves against ransomware. And a ransomware, like every other hacking activity, uses several kinds of information system: internet gateways, email gateways, file servers, workstations, corporate networks. We have to be able to correlate data from the different parts of the information system to be really clever in what we want to achieve. And the objective is really to find out every track of malicious activity. So it is really this point where our business can be challenged if we create some geographical barriers.
That's really interesting, because you kind of implied that some people would prefer stronger data localization, data protection to stronger security. And we can maybe talk about that. I like preferences, and preferences are an indicator of what people will do. But what I want to do now is invite all of the other speakers to join in the conversation, to ask Raphael questions, ask Andreas questions. Peter, you had an initial question. Should we start with you?
Yeah, I think to some extent Raphael answered, and this is, I mean, it's fantastic to be having these discussions of how it would disrupt a global ability to see attacks, including ransomware attacks. I do have a question for Andreas, perhaps, about within ENISA, when you have these possible concerns about ISO controls not being as effective or not being able to purchase the best, particular type of security software from other parts of the world, who within ENISA would be addressing that? Is there research we missed, perhaps, that is where ENISA has had public discussions about how to handle these difficult issues?
Thank you, Peter. ENISA is a regulatory agency under an EU classification, but does not produce regulation as such. The main example of regulation produced with the assistance of ENISA is these cybersecurity certification schemes that I subtly mentioned a moment ago. For the rest, ENISA analyzes data, it produces reports, recommendations, this sort of thing, but it's all voluntary. Whether anyone reads it, applies it, does anything with it, it's their business effectively, much less ENISA's. And then it works very closely with the member states to coordinate and facilitate the exchange of information in certain areas like CSIRT cooperation, CSIRT and law enforcement cooperation, this sort of thing. Slightly more operational, but not necessarily so. ENISA does not put its hands on member states' data. Member states put their hands on member states' data. So in a way, it's not so much an issue with international standards themselves. ENISA, on the contrary, supports and collaborates very closely with the EU standardization organizations. I mentioned an evolving an increasingly stronger relationship with the GSMA. We have a long-standing relationship with the ISO. We manifest this relationship by producing gaps analysis. Recently, we launched two significant, from our standpoint, chunks of work towards European standards organizations, one on a risk assessment method to determine assurance levels on cybersecurity certification. And then we're looking also into some work concerning security controls for cloud services. So this all demonstrates that ENISA indeed is using the opportunity of certification to work more closely with standards. By the way, the EU standards are 80% international ones. They're not, they're not genuinely produced at home. I mean, they're not homegrown products. They're more like ways to facilitate international collaboration, allow the international companies to do the business the best way they see it fit. So certification at this light is probably going to contribute into having more measurable outcomes, looking more closely at what suppliers are doing. We believe that on the level of product security, where we have long-standing experience with common criteria that dates back to 40, 50 years already, there have been good grounds at member state level, but now this experience needs to permeate all across the union. That's what the member states thought. It's not like it doesn't come from the EU as such. The EU put together the proposal. And then we need also some thrust in other areas. I mean, you have all the concerns around 5G that are not genuinely European ones, but they cut across other jurisdictions, and clearly cloud services, because the EU sees again an opportunity to use certification as a tangible proof that a certain level of cybersecurity has been attained to by a specific type of service providers. These are not necessarily the ones that provide the ground infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, but it's more the people that develop the services at the top layer. Therefore, when in an extreme situation, you could see some sort of link between the treatment of personal data under the GDPR and the prospective EU's cloud services certification, this sort of thing. It's not on the cards right now, but this could be the something to expect in the next few years.
I hope we get a chance to come back to that, because one of the things that occurred to me as you were all talking is we have a overly expansive definition of personal information, and that might be one of the problems. But Victoria, let me ask you, because you used one of my favorite hot button words. I think it was you when you said side loading. I love apps as a delivery vehicle for malware. I don't know why people don't understand that. But what would you say about, you said then side loading, you also said proportionate measures. What would some proportionate measures be? I mean,
okay, so I mean, the short answer is we don't know. And I think that's one of the points I've tried to highlight in my research, is that it's great to have rhetorical aspirations in the text of proposed legislation. And it's absolutely right, because we're talking about, you know, preserving people's fundamental rights. What we have a lot of uncertainty over right now is how all of this will actually work. So when I'm thinking about a company like Apple or Google wanting to prevent what looks like a malicious app being side-loaded onto EU citizens' devices, they're going to have to, at the moment, apply for an exemption to Articles 5 and 6 of the DMA. But in reality, security operations at scale means that many millions of exemptions might be required every day. And it seems to me, and I hope this isn't the case, I hope there has been sufficient consideration of this, but it seems to me that the EU institutions could be in for quite a surprise when companies like Apple and Google need to send in millions of these requests a day. So while I'm not suggesting for a second that global platforms like Google and Apple need to have a systemic exemption from these provisions for security reasons, there needs to be a greater consideration of the practical implications of this operational implementation. At the moment, nobody knows how this will actually work.
yeah, I used to work a long time ago with the Chinese office that reviews encryption. And on the first day they opened, they closed early at about 2 o'clock because they simply crashed from all the requests they were getting. But Raphael, let me ask you, when you think about side loading, what's the challenge for you? Any views on that?
For you about cyber, what? You don't know.
Side loading, I'm sorry, the idea of free access to unvetted apps. Yeah. Is that a problem, or?
Somehow, if we want to enable and to support the digital transformation and the way the different business will use efficiently the digital tools, we are also somehow obliged to provide a degree of liberty in the use of the different tools, particularly the collaborative tools. But that can't be, of course, at any price. And it's a trade-off between autonomization of the business unit by using some software as a service facilities, software as a service providers, and kind of central regulation and control by the group security of the company, for example. And the group security of the company will rely, of course, on the security provided by the service providers. Not security internally, but security by the service providers themselves. And that is really somewhere where we as a company are a lot challenged today by our customers. And that's why we also pass a lot of certifications, like, for example, the SOC 2 certification, to demonstrate our ability to handle the data across the different regions within the industry standards, the security standards. And there is a new job title that is upcoming and that we will see in the different companies, something between the lawyer and the chief security officer. We are seeing more and more some people, specialists of cloud security laws or cloud laws, and these people are really useful to make the link between the traditional security, which is obviously linked to kind of localization and barriers, and the security provided by the service provider, like, for example, and above all, the cloud service providers. we really see a lot of discussion between the chief security officer and law experts that are really specialized in cloud services and more generally everything which is provided as a service. That is really a very, very interesting challenge in the next few months or years.
Let me ask
could I just go very briefly, Jim, on that?
No, I was going to say, did people have reactions to that? So please.
Sorry. So in our discussion about third-party services, there's so many ways that people use software as a service, infrastructure as a service. And many of those services are specialized and many of them operate across borders because they're gathering data from across borders and their clients have activities across borders. And depending on how strictly the localization exists, the entire business model gets challenged. The entire ability of the service to provide service gets challenged. And so that's something we discuss in more detail in our paper. And I saw Raphael nod at that. So it seems like maybe we're on the right track in reality as well.
Anyone else? We raised a couple, the service, something as a service model, which I think is the direction many companies are moving in. We also raised the idea of certification, which I'm always a little nervous at certification. Common criteria it was useful, but it was also a big pain in the neck, frankly. And so how do we bring these things together? I understand the desire for certification. One way to do that is simply self-certification, right? Another way to think about it is, do we have some sort of external process? And that can be very tricky. So DeBrae, Andreas, Victoria, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. Go ahead.
Well, perhaps to complete, I think and it's not if, it's we are going, all of us, to the everything as a service model. So we will have to gain a consistent visibility of the different data flows across the different service providers, and also at the same time across the different geographical blocks or geographical continents or countries. I'm not sure we have the necessary tools today to do that. It's not really security, it's more a kind of data governance.
Good point. Andreas, Victoria?
Essentially, technology complexity compels the service model that you suggest, James, and it makes very good sense. If we wanted to picture that, our sheer inability to acquire physical devices that do things for us is going to be exacerbated in the years to come. I mean, already we have we're quite unable to get much out of technologies more closer to our grasp, like AI. If we simply try to tinker things in our garage alone, and we need service providers that can provide us with the tools and empower us to do so. But still, when we shift towards a service model, we relinquish control, because then neither at the physical level nor the logical level are we ever able to get full access to what's going on in the back end. And that's exactly the point. I mean, having the ability to measure something against a perceived standard, be it a business standard, business performance, certain contractual obligations through cloud service provision agreements, or even certification, does not seem all that weird then, in if we are moving increasingly more towards an expansive service model. So under this light, it's not like, certification is what I do, so hey, that's where I come from. But it's the logical conclusion that we need to underpin what we are doing on the basis of specific criteria, technical requirements, security requirements. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say that at the risk of sounding slightly flippant, I'd quite like to answer this question about the as a service model in about 6 months' time. Because what we're seeing, of course, is that technology service providers are withdrawing their service provision from Russia as we speak. And the extent to which technology service provision has become an instrument of economic sanction, I think, is super interesting from a researcher's perspective. So it's very difficult for someone like me to disentangle the as a service model from issues of digital sovereignty. And from, for instance, the moves that Russia has made over the last few years to create a sovereign RUNET. If we have a true, comprehensive, fully fledged as a service model, then all countries are entangled. It's not just about different sectors, providers, and clients. It's also about the geopolitical aspect as well. So it would be lovely to check back in a few months and see what the impact has been. We can already see the short-term impacts, but really we need to see some mid to longer term impacts, I think, to be able to answer that question as fully as I would like.
Great point, thank you. Let me turn now to some of the questions we've gotten from the audience. The first one was, what's your take on the current state of play in the ongoing WTO e-commerce negotiations? What terms of, let me see if I can read, what are the terms of agreement on issues related to data localization? And what will they look like if the WTO negotiation is successfully concluded by the end of the year? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that one. No. Well, we'll take it as something that we'll come back to in some later work then. But it's a good question. Another question, if democratizing data localization has the potential to increase security risks with forum shopping and untraceability, does research indicate any similar risks in increasing data localization becomes increasingly monopolized? And they bring up the issues of censorship, propaganda, and information manipulation. Peter, I see you want to take that one first.
I can address the second piece about propaganda and semantic manipulation. As when we teach this in class, it turns out that the cat and mouse game, the attackers keep coming up with new attacks, the defenders keep coming up with new defenses, is very similar to traditional cybersecurity cat and mouse attacker defender games. And there's a relevance for that for data localization, right? So if you're the defender and you're trying to figure out, for instance, is this Russian misinformation, then having data from different places can give you very important hints about the likely origins of various things. And if you data localize, it'll make it harder, I think, just as it makes it harder to have global understanding of cybersecurity risks, it makes it harder to have global understanding of information manipulation from adversary nations, or not just nations, but also the other kinds of folks who do it. So I think the logic applies very directly, and that there's significant risk from data localization to being able to weed out manipulative content.
Interesting. Anyone else, Victoria?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of your own citizen population, of course, data localization, if we think about the Russian blogging law, it's a lot easier, or it's perceived to be a lot easier to control the information and the narrative. And in that context, I think the current negotiations to elaborate the UN Cybercrime Convention are very interesting to watch, because what we've seen from the national contributions to that is a huge disparity, a real range of what exactly should be criminalized. And if you're India, you think that the proposed UN Cybercrime Convention is about sorting out cyberspace governance, the whole caboodle of cyberspace governance. If you're Russia, unsurprisingly, You would like to have, pro-suicide and self-harm ideation content internationally outlawed, because content control, falsehoods, whether you brand it fake news, disinformation, misinformation, knowing untruths, that strange kind of nebulous category. But there are countries who are much more focused on content control, and they're the countries that we would fully expect to be focused on content control, all the way to the US, the UK, the Five Eyes, who are much more focused on cooperation in clearing up cybercrimes at an international level. But it's a great read, all of those different contributions, simply because you can elicit from that a country's stance around cyberspace governance and controlling the narrative.
A long time ago, when I used to work with the Russians at the UN, they had some draft ideas they put forward for a code of conduct. And one of my favorites was they had something that said, freedom of speech is a fundamental right, comma, subject to national law. And so for me, that kind of encapsulates their views, not in a helpful way. But anyone else on this point? We have another question that I'd like to turn to, but I want to give you the chance to respond. No? The question is, currently there is technology to segregate cloud workloads within regional and geographic locations. Would that not work to localize data to its location? A bit technical, might be beyond the group, but I think if anyone wants to tackle it, otherwise I'll throw something in. So
I could give it a try, James, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm not claiming technical expertise on cloud, but I could certainly suggest that Louis is having a strong point when he points to segregated data. That's how it works with regional and local data centers. And US infrastructure providers have gone to lengths to make available such data centers across the EU in all sorts of different jurisdictions or across the member states. However, there might be further layers that need to be put under the spotlight. They could include, for instance, accessing data exclusively in a specific jurisdiction. Imagine you have the service provider works with public administrations, with sensitive health data, with national security data. Why should such data be accessible in anywhere else? It could be banking data. We have banking laws in Luxembourg that are quite strict, and so on and so forth. And even the country of incorporation of the service provider itself might come under light. So indeed, this is a good example, but there's further layers that need to be examined in this case.
And here in our research, part of what you get from the comments to the ADPB are companies that are saying things like HR function. So if you have employees that are in the EU, but your HR function or your HR director is in the US, then you likely have a problem. Another issue that comes up is, again, if you have those employees in the EU, but the company is headquartered in the US, and those EU employees have an IT issue, and they need to escalate that to the person that's in the US, then you have some more concerns there.
And an example that flows in the other direction is that, and Peter may know about this, in some of the privacy discussions, we discovered that some of the biggest consumers of transatlantic data flows were German car companies, because of course the car is increasingly a rolling computer, and the data flows back for maintenance, for upkeep, for other things, would have been a serious problem for them. So, I think that the workload issue, we've talked a lot about security, we've talked less about workload, and maybe this would create, in some instances, a workload problem for companies. So,
well, one thing we haven't mentioned is smaller countries. So up until now, we've been focusing on India and the EU and the US, which are enormous blocks, but we're getting data localization rules across numerous other countries. And a data center in Pakistan, different from India, different from Malaysia, different from Indonesia, depending on the company's size and scope, it's going to be really hard to localize in 200 countries. And so at least some part of the thinking here is not just EU, US, but how do you get to a global approach where the security is going to be good and we're not importing great amounts of cybersecurity risks from smaller countries that can't necessarily do these things.
Yeah, at least one of the cloud companies has actually put a price on how much it costs to open a local data center in one country, so that if the market justifies it, they'll open the data center. That doesn't solve the problem, though, that we've all raised of transferring the data across borders. And that's, I think, a deliberate problem, a difficult problem. We're coming to the end of our time, so let me, did we get one more question? I'm sorry. We did. One more question, then I'll ask you for final remarks. Okay. Given that there's some trade agreements that are including digital trade and privacy in their provisions, what are some of the things the Biden administration, and I'll extend that to say European governments as well, what are some of the things that governments could do, perhaps in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, perhaps in the TTC, to address data localization and cyber? And that's a good one, because it actually says if you were writing negotiating language, if you were writing the text of an agreement, what would that text look like? So that might be a useful way for people to think about it.
Right, just one short idea is that by recognizing there is an issue here, starting to draft language for at least certain kinds of cybersecurity data will be opened up for flows. Basically starting to build some exceptions from blockades for cybersecurity purposes. And notwithstanding everything else, you're allowed to transfer certain categories of data. Some of the data that Raphael was indicating is being done not to track individuals, but to meet different goals. It could become part of the trade negotiations and raise the visibility of the issue.
Anyone else views on that? What would be useful to provide?
Agreements are very strong instruments, especially some international ones. But in the case of personal data, we've managed to strike down two such instruments. Firstly, the safe harbor, and then the privacy shield. Therefore, the prospects might not be bright unless we try the third time. Yes.
Yeah. This is more of a comment, but it definitely fits in. And this always happens when you come to the end of the event. Suddenly there's a flow of comments. But someone wrote in, perhaps one case to consider is the province of British Columbia in Canada that recently withdrew its previous data localization laws, in part because they were just unworkable. So I don't know if anyone has any insights in that. We've brought that part of the problem up. We've brought up the part of the problem of the need for some kind of increased data sovereignty. I don't know if anyone knows the British Columbia case. No? Well, it's a good point, worth looking into. Go ahead.
I don't know, but that's a good point. I don't know, but I also see sometimes some local province or region that are calling for the local enterprise to host the data within the region. It's not for security, nor privacy, nor legal purpose. It's just to sustain the local industry. That can be this also. And again, I think every time we are talking about data localization, we really have to think what is the purpose we want to achieve, and is it a legitimate purpose, and how can we use the different tools to achieve this goal, and perhaps not not harming the other goals we also want to achieve at the same time.
That's a really good point. Anyone else have final remarks for the panel? It's been a very rich discussion. We covered a lot of ground. We could have used more time, but Peter, a final remark.
Just a short comment on British Columbia of all things. My recollection is after the USA Patriot Act was enacted, British Columbia passed some of these laws to prevent British Columbia citizens' data from being subject to Patriot Act surveillance in the United States. It was similar in that respect to the concerns we've seen from Europe about US intelligence access or Cloud Act, US law enforcement access. It's interesting to note that after they tried doing that, apparently according to the reporting, they've now withdrawn it. But these concerns about security and spying by those people overseas is a huge motivator for people who are worried and want to have localization. And so that part has to be addressed as well. And it's partly being addressed through things like negotiations at OECD on government access rules. But that's where some of the fear comes, in addition to the other issues that we've seen.
Victoria.
Well, just to throw a final grenade into the room, following up on that point.
We've only got 3 minutes.
Well, it's a thought for another session. At the same time as we have those concerns and data localization, laws being pulled and introduced in concern for foreign transfers to law enforcement agencies, at the same time, of course, we do have other countries looking to ban end-to-end encryption or to have workarounds to end-to-end encryption. I think probably Australia would be the most notable amongst those. So we have, again, these tensions between wanting to preserve people's data, increase security, but also to have cutouts and banning enhanced privacy technologies in other circumstances. So a little bit schizophrenic, in my opinion.
Yeah, those are topics that are lots of fun, but too hard to deal with in the remaining 2 minutes. I will say that I do think that it would be possible, having seen the information collected, at least on European targets, it would be, which is very small and not very useful, it would be possible to provide some sort of multilateral reassurance on the issue of mass surveillance, because people are backing away from it. It's not necessary. That's not the note we want to close on, however. I think we had a good discussion of data localization. The political imperatives for data governance and data localization aren't going away, but I think a number of you said, this is sort of the first iteration of tools. This is the first iteration of rules, and we will probably need to adjust them to make them both more precise and less damaging, certainly to security. So with that, Andreas, DeBrae, Peter, Victoria, Raphael, great discussion. Thank you so much for attending. Let me point out to those in the audience that the remarks were recorded and we will have them available on, I think, on YouTube. So if there were parts you really liked, feel free to watch them again. Thank you. Everyone have a good day.